This video is being presented in two parts. It's on enforced or slave labor. A fairly recent attempt to demonize America is the 1619 Project. This is a program designed by the New York Times with the goal of re-examining the legacy of slavery in the United States. This program ignores entirely the role of progressives played in the history of slavery. They have not only made excuses for the Soviet Gulag, but have involved the U.S. government directly in the slave trade. In October 1944, President Roosevelt addressed the Foreign Policy Association in New York, stating, "The German people are not going to be enslaved because the United Nations do not traffic in human slavery." It should have been unnecessary for the President of the United States to proclaim the American policy on slavery. The policy had been established in the middle of the 19th century after a long and bloody war. It's an integral part of the U.S. Constitution. The 13th Amendment of the Constitution states, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime, whereof the party shall be duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction." The leaders of the United States government claimed that they were animated by the rule of law. General Eisenhower stated, "If the Germans were reasoning like normal human beings, they would realize that the whole history of the United States and Great Britain is to be generous towards defeated enemies. We observe the laws of the Geneva Convention." This policy was not only a basic law of the United States, it was also considered a fundamental principle of international law. Fritz Sauckel, the chief organizer of conscripted labor for Nazi Germany, would pay with his life for his role in organizing the Nazi slave labor program. Perhaps it would be best to conclude any discussion of the use of forced labor at this point, as most accounts of the period do. However, on close inspection, events following the conclusion of hostilities do not appear to conform to U.S. policy. The subject is extremely difficult for defenders of President Roosevelt's post-war policies to explain. The most effective defense is to omit any reference to slave labor. When the subject does arise, the euphemism forced labor is used for what was clearly slave labor. In closed meetings, the use of the term slave labor was used. In March 6, 1945 British Cabinet meeting, a value of $16 billion was assigned for the 4 million slave laborers claimed by the Soviet Union. Slave labor was a topic of discussion in the Roosevelt administration for some time. Contrary to what the president's statement said, the proposal to use slave labor was looked upon with favor by many key members of the administration. According to Secretary of State Hull, the president stated during a conference in October of 43 that, quote, he thought that reparations should be exacted in manpower and equipment, unquote. The subject of using slave labor was also a topic of discussion at the Tehran Conference in November of 43, where Stalin demanded at least 4 million Germans to be used as forced labor. Clearly, the use of forced labor was a topic of discussion at least as early as 1943. It is therefore not surprising that it would be included in the Morgenthau Plan. The Morgenthau Memorandum given to the president in September 44, the use of slave labor is suggested. The provision was also included in the final version of the Morgenthau Plan. Section 5 of the plan states, restitution and reparations shall be effected by the transfer of existing German resources and territory. And number D is by forced German labor outside Germany. The United States government, represented by President Roosevelt, sanctioned the use of slave labor at the Yalta Conference in February 1945. The agreement concluded concerning forced labor is contained in the Yalta Protocol. Number 2, reparations in kind is to be extracted from Germany in the 3 following forms. And item C is use of German labor. Edward Stettinius recorded that the subject was brought up at Yalta by President Roosevelt. Stettinius stated, the president next raised the question of German reparations. He pointed out that the United States did not desire reparations in the form of labor, and he was sure that Great Britain held the same view. At the time, the president appears to have been correct about the British not wanting enforced labor. During the British cabinet meeting in 1945, attended by Winston Churchill, the future Prime Minister Clement Attlee stated it would be to our advantage to make it clear to the Soviets claim for reparations was exclusive of labor because we don't want labor. It was during this meeting that the value of 4 million slaves retained by the Soviets at $16 billion. Apparently, the British had a change of heart, and under Prime Minister Attlee, the British saw the value of enforced labor and argued for its continuance. Attempts to conceal the truth about the origin of this barbaric proposal began almost immediately. If we are to believe Secretary of State Burns, this section of the Yalta Agreement was included as a result of a misunderstanding of the remarks made by President Roosevelt. According to Secretary of State Burns, the Yalta Protocol, which on the last day of the conference was submitted to the heads of government for final approval, also contained a statement that the Reparations Commission could consider the use of labor as a possible source of reparations. There was no discussion of this proposal at the conference table except a passing reference by the president in which he said the United States cannot take manpower as the Soviet Union can. Later, I learned that the language was included by Mr. Maysky, the Soviet representative, subsequently agreed to by other delegations. At any rate, I did not know at the time I left Yalta. Had I known, I would have urged the president to oppose the inclusion in the protocol of any provision for the use of large groups of human beings as enforced slave laborers. The details of the proposal were worked out by Under Secretary of State Edward Stettinius in his discussions with the Soviets. Stettinius recorded that on February 9th, 1945, quote, we then turned to the subject of German reparations. I said I would like to present some counterproposals to the document prepared by Mr. Wyszynski and Mr. Maysky. I had discussed these proposals that morning with President Roosevelt. Stettinius suggested that the discussion of the use of German labor by way of reparations be postponed and dealt with by the Reparations Commission. The British representative, Anthony Eden, also felt that the question of use of slave labor should be discussed at a later date by the Reparations Commission. The discussion of the use of labor as a form of reparations was later dropped by the Truman administration at the Potsdam Conference. Apparently, Truman did not want to put his signature on a document authorizing the use of slave labor. The Secretary of State Burns recorded that, quote, another aspect of the reparations agreement made at Potsdam has not received the attention it deserves. The recommendations made at Yalta that the use of German labor should be considered by the Reparations Commission as a source of possible reparations was dropped by the Big Three at Potsdam, and the protocol signed there contained no provision for or reference to the use of labor as reparations. However, the policy had been set, and like many policies of the Roosevelt administration, the Truman administration followed through with it. The policy had widespread support among the Allies. According to Professor Brian Loring Villa, as of June 1945, the British wanted 250,000, the French some 2 million, Belgium 45,000, Norway 25,000. Villa stated that it is interesting to observe the Prime Minister Clement Attlee, who presumably represented the interests of working men, insisted on exploiting German slave labor. This is a rare example of the term slave labor being used to describe this condition publicly. The U.S. representative on the Reparations Commission that would meet in Moscow was Ed Pauley and his associate representative Isidore Lubin. Lubin was the chief of the Bureau of Labor Statistics and had been a close advisor to President Roosevelt. Lubin, like White, was also the son of Lithuanian and Polish Jewish immigrants, and this may explain his vehement advocacy for slave labor. Although, according to Secretary of State Burns, this commission contained no provision for the use of labor, it's interesting to note that Lubin's attitude, he wanted to enlarge the category of people subject to enslavement. He wanted to include children in the category as well. William Casey recalled a dinner meeting attended by Lubin. Quote, I remember vividly during dinner one evening at Claridge with General Donovan, Justice Jackson, Ed Pauley, who had just been appointed Reparations Commissioner, and Isidore Lubin, chief of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, who had signed on as Pauley's deputy. Lubin spoke at length with considerable vehemence about why it was important to convict the Hitlerjugend and other organizations en masse so that Russian demands for reparations could be satisfied by German labor. Although provisions for the use of forced labor were not included in the Potsdam Agreement or apparently discussed at the Reparations Commission, the record reveals that understandings were reached concerning this issue. Again, Secretary of State Burns attempted to put the issue in the best possible light. In 1947, Burns recorded that although this policy had been dropped, I regret to say that Germans and Japanese still are being held in Allied hands for the use of labor. Later he recalled, quote, it's a deplorable fact that thousands of Germans and Japanese are still being held as enforced laborers in violation of solemn international pledges. Brian's statement about the number of prisoners is perfectly true. It would also be true to state that dozens of prisoners were being held. But how many dozens? How many thousands? Burns' statement is a classical example of understatement. At the time he made this statement, the number of prisoners engaged in slave labor amounted to several million. According to Eugene Davison, the number was 4 million in March 1947. Prisoners of a totalitarian regime are obviously in a precarious position. Literally tens of millions have perished in slave labor camps during the 20th century. Remarkably, the prisoners of war held by the Western democracies were to find themselves living and dying under conditions similar to those of the Soviet Union. The very nature of slavery had changed since the writing of the 13th Amendment. The modern slave was the property of the state. Slaveholders in previous centuries owned their slaves. They had a vested interest in their physical well-being of what they considered their property. The modern form of state slavery frequently treats the subject as an expendable asset in addition to an enemy of the state. The modern form of slavery places the traditional slave in an enviable position. It appears that the modern state would have the slave labor while simultaneously liquidating him. The American representatives not only condoned the use of slave labor by their allies, but also provided them with large numbers of prisoners for that purpose. Stephen Ambrose provides a simple explanation for this transfer of prisoners of war. Quote, what happened is simple enough. The Allies could not afford to feed the millions of German prisoners at the same level at which they fed German civilians, not to mention the civilians of liberated countries of Western Europe. Secretary of State Burns gave similar explanation. In the closing days of the war against Germany, we took so many prisoners, it was difficult to care for them behind the lines, and guarding them required so many troops that General Eisenhower decided to transfer many of them to the custody of liberated nations. But these prisoners surrendered to the United States, and we therefore retained responsibility. The POWs could not be cared for properly, so they were transferred for humanitarian reasons. One of these liberated nations was the Soviet Union. General Eisenhower was well aware that the Soviet Union was not signatory to the Geneva Convention. Yet, according to Edward Peterson, he turned over several hundred thousand who had fled to the Americans to avoid being taken prisoners by the Russians in May 1945 to the Red Army in a gesture of friendship. According to Peterson, General Eisenhower did not transfer these prisoners out of necessity, but out of a desire to please the Soviets. Had Eisenhower been a German general who handed over hundreds of thousands of Allied prisoners to a non-signatory of the Geneva Convention, he likely would have found himself seated next to the defendants at the Nuremberg trials. The contention that prisoners were transferred to other powers because the U.S. Army could not care for them does not explain the transfer that occurred long after the end of hostilities. Secretary of State Burns recognized that fact, and prisoners should be returned as soon as the end of hostilities. And he stated, the Geneva Convention of War, in letter and spirit, contemplates the repatriation of prisoners as soon as possible after the end of actual fighting. Perhaps Secretary Burns was not aware of the fact that the Geneva Convention did not apply to German prisoners. This was the result of a clever semantic maneuver. James Bakke points out that Eisenhower had sent a message to the Combined Chiefs of Staff in March 1945 proposing the creation of a new class of prisoners who would not be protected by the Geneva Convention. He supposedly felt this necessary because he believed it would be difficult to feed this large mass of prisoners at the level required by the convention. On April 26, the Combined Chiefs of Staff replied, creating the status of disarmed enemy forces. The status was approved for prisoners of war in American hands only. At this point, German prisoners were no longer prisoners of war, but disarmed enemy forces, not entitled to the protection of the Geneva Convention. Ambrose claimed that Bakke credited Eisenhower with the decision to deny prisoners the protection of the Geneva Convention by changing their status. According to Ambrose, Bakke believed that Eisenhower made this decision personally, secretly, and with sinister intent. Ambrose believes that this decision was made by the European Advisory Commission because the United States and other allies had signed the Geneva Convention and did not wish to violate it. Although Bakke's claim that the British refused to adopt the American plan for their own prisoners, apparently they followed a similar policy. Field Marshal Montgomery wrote a memo to General Zhukov in November 1945 stating, ex-Wehrmacht prisoners were not described as prisoners of war because we did not wish to apply the Geneva Convention to them. Conditions under which the prisoners were held varied greatly. The British held their prisoners under relatively benign conditions, perhaps with the view that these experienced troops might be needed one day. In spite of the earlier thoughts that the British would not require labor, they apparently changed their minds. According to Field Marshal Montgomery, the British government required 225 Germans as reparations labor for the United Kingdom. According to Earl Zimke, U.S. forces were using over 500,000 prisoners in military labor service units. There's no definitive figure for the number of prisoners captured and held by the Soviets. In the chaos of the Eastern Front, there was no firm accounting. It was not unusual for prisoners to be shot immediately after capture. And there's also the factor that historians often have an agenda that inclines them to either exaggerate or minimize the number of captured by the Soviets, depending on the point they're trying to make. Eugene Davidson reported that how many prisoners the Russians were holding was a matter of long, inconclusive controversy. Hoover's figure was more than 3 million. Edward Peterson gave a range of figures. The estimated number ranged from 890,000 to 3.5 million, assumed by the Germans on the basis of the 4 million captured. Peterson also mentioned that the Russians claimed to have captured over 3 million. Secretary Burns reported that Stalin told Harry Hopkins in June 1945 that he was holding about 2 million prisoners, of whom 1,700,000 were German. Bakke reported that the Soviets captured 2,389,000 between June 41 and September 45. In addition to prisoners of war, the Soviets abducted a large number of civilians. Alfred de Zayas reported that according to the German Red Cross, it is estimated that 874,000 German civilians were abducted by the Soviet Union. Mortality rates among the captured are a matter of great controversy. The estimated mortality rate to the number captured by the victor, the West German government estimated that there were 1,400,000 persons missing as of March 31st, 1950. If they did not die in Russian captivity, then other nations were responsible. Bakke gave several mortality figures from all fronts. More than 700,000 prisoners of war and paramilitary civilians died in Soviet captivity. Later, he reported that 1 million Germans on hand in the Soviet Union in 1945, until the last prisoner went home in 1955. About 94,000 died. It's 9.4%. He also stated that of the 2,200,000 the Soviets captured between June 41 and September 45, 450,000 German soldiers died. And Peterson gave a 75% mortality rate for captives of the Soviets. Quote, deaths during captivity presumably accounted for 75% of the prisoners. Out of 60,000 Italians known captured, only 12,500 returned. They had probably taken a large number of civilians, including women. Of one such group of 1,300 German women, 800 died in 2 years. And that's according to the Manchester Guardian. S.P. Mackenzie reported of the 594,000 Japanese troops captured by the Soviets in Manchuria in the last weeks of the war, 300,000 remained unaccounted for in the 1970s. According to Alfred de Zayas, 874,000 German civilians abducted to the Soviet Union, 45% perished. Bakke quoted a former POW named G. Kurtz, who reported, I survived Stalingrad, the exhausting marches. I even survived the death camp at Bekatovka, where in a couple of weeks of my 55,000 comrades, 42,000 had died from hunger and disease. This resulted in a mortality rate of 76% in a matter of weeks. Germany's allies did not fare any better. Nikolai Tolstoy reported that about 320,000 Romanian soldiers had been taken prisoner, about 130,000 of whom were captured after hostilities ceased. In addition, there were 100,000 more who had been recruited into the Hungarian army. Of this total 420,000, less than half, 190,000, ever returned home. The French government requested 1,700,000 prisoners of war to be used as enforced labor. In July 45, Schaeff agreed to provide 1.3 million prisoners for labor in France. There are conflicting reports on how many prisoners were actually delivered to the French. A State Department memo from Secretary of State and to the Ambassador of France in February 47 mentions 740,000 prisoners transferred to France in July 45. The memo stated that 290,000 of these prisoners have been stricken off the rolls and expressed a desire for a breakdown of what happened to the prisoners. Yet on March 13th, 1947, the American ambassador to France relayed a message stating that the French had 630,000 prisoners at the present time. The memo did not address the missing 290,000 prisoners. It stated, in addition, to the 450,000 referred to by the United States, 180,000 were captured by the French forces. Baki stated that primarily between July and September 45, the Americans granted them, the French, around 800,000 POWs and the British 55,000. In 1947, the War Department informed Senator Nolan that the United States Army had transferred a total of 600,000 prisoners to the French. Eugene Davidson gives a figure of 440,000. The fate of these prisoners was foreseen by General Patton, who wrote in his diary, "I'm also opposed to sending PWs to work as slave laborers in foreign lands, in particular to France, where many will be starved to death." General Patton continued, "It's amusing to recall we fought the revolution in defense of the rights of man and the Civil War to abolish slavery, and have gone back on both those principles." Problems arose almost immediately after the cessation of hostilities about the health of the prisoners. Dr. Ernest Fisher, a senior historian with the United States Army Center for Military History, claims starting in April 45, the United States Army and the French Army casually annihilated 1 million men, most of them in American camps. Conditions in the camps threatened to become a public scandal, and French officials began blaming the Americans for the conditions, while the Americans began blaming the French. The literature contains several references to the harsh conditions in French camps, and Eugene Davidson wrote, "The French were getting thousands of Germans from American POWs camps, and these men were treated in such a fashion that American officers compared them to the emaciated inmates the Allies had liberated from Dachau." Now, this will be continued in a following video.